Well, hello everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of Seed Speaks. My name is Alex Martin, and I serve as the editor of Seed World magazine. And today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be your host. We've gotten a nice peek over the last few weeks into different topics around GMOs. We even teased a little bit into the topic we're going to talk about today. But today, we're here to tackle the idea behind GMO and labeling. It's a difficult topic that's been particularly big in the U.S., but it's growing in conversation across the globe as regulatory bodies work to create regulations around food labels. So our two speakers today are going to help us dive into not only the idea of labeling and the consumer mistrust that comes around with it, but also we're going to look at it from an economic standpoint and even a nutrition standpoint to some extent. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers of the day. We're joined with Joe Schwartz, director of McGill University's Office for Science and Society, and Jason Lusk, head of Purdue University's Agricultural Economics Department. So I'd like to give each of our speakers a minute to briefly introduce themselves. So Joe, you've actually joined us before, so welcome back to Seed Speaks. And would you mind just giving us a little bit of the skinny into yourself?
Sure. My background is chemistry, and I'm a chemistry professor here at McGill, but I also serve as director of McGill's Office for Science and Society, which is a rather unique venture for a university. Our mandate is to separate sense from nonsense, myth from fact, for our students and for the public at large. And we do this on a variety of platforms, written articles in newspapers. I have a radio show, television appearances, obviously a pretty large presence on social media. I write books. And basically, we try to make sure that the public is up to date on what is happening in the world of science. We separate sense from nonsense and hopefully keep them out of the clutches of the charlatans. That's what we do.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe. And if any of y'all are interested, Joe does write a column with our sister publication, European Seed. So if y'all are interested in some of his opinions, you should check it out. It's a fantastic column. I read every issue of European Seed quarterly as well. But thank you so much, Joe. And Jason, I'd like to give you the same moment. Can you give a little insight into yourself and what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Happy to be on. I am a food and agricultural economist. At the moment, I'm the head of the Agricultural Economics Department at Purdue University. We have about 40 faculty here that study economics, all parts of our food system, all the way from farm management, ag input supply, which would include things like seed, agribusiness management, to environmental economics, development economics. My own particular areas of research mainly focus on consumer demand issues and how food policies and shifts in consumer demand and acceptance, consumer acceptance or rejections of new food technologies impact farmers and the rest of the food system. I should say, in addition to a PhD in economics, I also have an undergraduate degree in food technology and food science.
Perfect. Well, it sounds like you're going to fit right into this panel, Jason. So thank you for joining us as well. Well, with those two introductions, I'd like to go ahead and dive into some of our questions we have. And Joe, I'm going to actually start our first question with you. So different countries have been feeling out things when it comes to GMOs, especially when it comes to labeling regulations, which is what we're here to talk about today. The US in particular has been working on firming up our GMO labeling regulations as well. But I wanted to just ask in general, what have you been seeing in terms of GMO and labeling regulations? I know you're based in Canada, so I'm sure Canada has some different regulations than the US as well.
Right. I've been, looking at labeling of foods for decades for many different reasons. The constant sort of suggestion by the bloggers out there that if you can't pronounce it, you shouldn't be eating it. So people have had questions about, whether or not they should be eating foods that contain ingredients that are multisyllabic. And, I like to point out that beta-fructofuranosyl alpha-D-glucopyranoside, which might leave a bad taste in someone's mouth because it's multisyllabic, is actually the chemical name for sugar. So I've long been dealing with these kind of issues. But more recently, of course, the question comes up about genetic modified ingredients and whether or not foods should be so labeled. And in Canada, we do not have regulations that say that a food has to be labeled as genetically modified. If the food is equivalent to its quote natural counterpart, then there's no need for any kind of labeling. And there haven't been too many issues about this. Of course, we do have an anti-GMO movement as exists in many other countries, but it hasn't been extremely vocal. And while I've had questions, I always have my fingers on the pulse of the nation because of my radio show where I get questions asked, so I know what they're worried about. And there's much greater worry these days about endocrine disruptors and so-called forever chemicals, the perfluoro compounds and bisphenol A and these than about GMOs. I think the concern is fading a little bit. So I don't see big activity here demanding any kind of change in labeling. I just haven't seen that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joe. Jason, I'll flip around the question to you, and I'm sure you're fairly, based on your description of yourself and what you do, you're pretty in tune with it as well. I'm kind of interested to see how GMO labeling might affect economic decisions, particularly with those normal people in the grocery stores. Have you seen any impacts that new labeling regulations are having on consumers?
Well, as you know, Alex, the mandatory labeling law that we have will officially, food manufacturers and retailers have to start complying in January 2022. Mm-hmm. So we're still pretty early on, and so most of the research that I've seen done is really, what we call ex ante, beforehand. We're projecting what will happen, rather than the sorts of analysis that we might do after the fact to see, what actually happened, because we're still in the midst of seeing how this thing is going to work out. If we look at the consumer research, which you alluded to, the impacts and those consumer choices are really going to depend a lot in how food manufacturers and food retailers respond to the new labeling policy. So just to give some nuance there, food manufacturers can, if they have a product that is required to be labeled, they can comply with that label in any number of ways. They can put text on the front that says the product is bioengineered or contains genetically engineered ingredients. They can use a new symbol that the U.S. Department of Agriculture created, a bioengineered symbol. They can use a QR code to disclose the presence of ingredients that have been produced with biotechnology. Or they can even just list in the ingredient list the product name, let's say, a soybean meal or something, and then in parentheses, put the disclosure there. So, how manufacturers, retailers choose to label is probably going to determine a lot of how consumers respond and react to it. And, our research seems to suggest that most consumers, while not very knowledgeable on these, I agree with Joe too. This is an issue that probably is not front of mind for most consumers. But nonetheless, if you force people to make a choice and one product doesn't have a disclosure and one, explicitly mentions something about, genetically engineered ingredients, people on average will tend to, if the prices are the same, switch over and prefer the one that without that disclosure on it. And then, QR codes are probably at the very other far end of that list, that most people just don't click through on those QR codes. So the impacts of those are probably more minimal. Where you also might see some impacts in terms of, how it affects the consumers is, again, it's consumers choosing, but it's also retailers choosing. And if retailers don't want to disclose, they may choose to try to source ingredients that are not genetically engineered. And that's where a lot of the costs come in when we think about the economics. They tend to be more expensive if you're sourcing, particularly organic, but also even non-GMO varieties. And if that's the choices some retailers make to avoid disclosure, that will result in higher prices that consumers pay.
Perfect. Thank
Can
you
I
so
just
much.
ask you a question before we go on? One of the things that always has bugged me is what happens, let's say, if you have soybean oil in some product, and that comes from GM soybeans. But of course, the finished product, the oil, has no vestige of any genetic modification. Are they going to have to label that as coming from as a source of GMOs?
Right. It's a great question. And now you need a lawyer rather than an economist. So it depends on how the law was written. My understanding, which could be wrong, maybe somebody out there will correct me, is that you don't actually have to disclose that if there's none of that protein present in the product. But again, I'm not the lawyer here. So consult your lawyer before making a label claim. But I think that is a very relevant discussion, and it does speak to some of these kind of crazy things you see on the flip side of labeling, like the non-GMO sea salt, for example. That's sort of silly because salt is a mineral that doesn't have DNA, can't be genetically engineered, and so I think there have been some efforts, I think even in this most recent labeling law, to try to pull out those products that might have been derived from a biotech ingredient, but don't have any of the principal components that would have any of the protein or any of the genetically engineered parts still remaining with it. But the truth is, I don't know how that's being interpreted at the moment.
Awesome. Thank you for the question, Joe. That was an excellent question. And y'all are actually just leading me into my next question, which I had a follow-up for you, Jason. But Joe, I know you are going to have something I'm sure, would like to comment on as well. But I know there are a lot of labeling endeavors out there, such as the non-GMO project. So to both of you, have you seen any impacts from organizations like that economically, or has that kind of skewed consumers to more non-GMO or organic products? Because you bring up a great point, Jason, that it sometimes appears on products that don't have GMOs that exist.
I can speak to some of the consumer research we've done. People like that butterfly label, the non-GMO label. If everything's the same, same brand name, same prices, people are, on average, not everybody, of course, but on average, the sort of median consumer will tend to want that product that has the non-GMO label. So it does have an influence on choice. It is impactful. In fact, it often has as big an impact as an organic label, which is interesting. In fact, you saw when those labeling laws were passed, you even saw some organic organizations, coming out with these arguments that organic is non-GMO and more, because what they were finding is consumers were conflating those two things. The other thing you ask a little bit about sort of misperceptions is if you ask people what they think that label means, the non-GMO label means in terms of things related to safety, health, nutrition, and what have you, often it creates a bit of a halo. It sort of inflates people's perceptions, beliefs about products that probably the best science doesn't support, and so it does probably mislead in some sense in terms of making consumers believe certain things about the product that, again, maybe the science doesn't really wouldn't support.
Perfect. Thank you, Jason. Joe, do you have anything you want to add about, I know you brought up some other organizations as well that are doing similar things.
Well, to me, the biggest problem we face is that people really don't know what GMOs are. So it's easy to avoid it because it just sounds like it's something that should be avoided, because why else would you put a labeled non-GMO on a product? But my experience has been, and I spend a lot of time talking to members of the public, is that the best thing to do is to start a conversation with the anti-GMO people by asking, can you please just explain to me in a brief sentence or two what GMOs are? And of course, they usually get stuck. They have absolutely no idea. And that opens the door to give them a rational explanation for what we really are talking about. But scientific illiteracy is the poison of our world today. And, obviously not only in this area, but in, with the anti-vaxxers and the hydroxychloroquine promoters and the ivermectin promoters. It's just undermining public trust in science. And I think biotechnology also suffers from that, that people are just tending not to trust science. And a lot of that is because of all the nonsense that we see on the social media, which is just not science-based. So these are the kind of problems that we face.
I think we might have lost Joe for a minute. So until he gets back, thank you for your question, Joe. It looks like you're back on there. In the meantime, I'm going to ask one of our lovely audience questions. I'm going to start with our question from Mark Sinkowitz. And Jason, I think I'm going to start with this question directed to you. We're talking about how these labeling laws are coming into effect in the US soon, January 2022, which is in the next couple of months. So can companies turn these labels to their advantage somehow? And if so, is there any suggestion you might have from your time looking into consumer perspective on them?
Yeah, I think an argument an advocate for labels would make is it empowers consumers to make choices, expands the opportunity set for consumers, and that has some value. I think, as I mentioned, we want to make sure, try to, as an educator, do the best we can. People are making choices with the best available information, but in general, empowering people to make choices, I think, is a positive aspect of some of this. So how can this label initiative be used to advantage? I can think of a couple things. One is, as I mentioned, QR codes can be used to disclose the presence of genetically engineered ingredients. So that actually provides an opportunity to perhaps provide additional information. Shelf or real estate is often scarce on food packaging, so you probably can't say everything you want to say about a product or its advantages or disadvantages. And so it's been kind of frustrating to me, looking back in the past, that there haven't been food manufacturers that were willing to come out and say, we use genetically engineered ingredients and we're proud of it. That they label proactively as a promotional device, because I think there are a lot of really good, positive messages that can be made there. And so perhaps with the ability to use QR codes to convey additional information, you can also disclose and educate at the same time. That's a possibility. Another maybe a possible upside of this as well is I've often thought that some of the aversion that consumers have towards GMOs is that they just don't, I think as Joe mentioned, don't really understand them and don't really see the benefits of them in many ways. To the typical consumer, the main benefit is that food's cheaper than it would have been otherwise. But that's a hard thing to translate to. But if we develop products over time that create benefits for those end consumers, whether it's nutrition or shelf life or non-browning, these sorts of things, and then consumers start associating that with, oh, this product says it's bioengineered and it's not browning, or it has a higher nutritional content, or a better longer shelf life, or whatever the benefit is. I think that's a real opportunity because they start to see, oh, this is a technology that gives me something. And so I think in some ways, a lot of solution to consumer aversion to these technologies lies in the technology itself, that the technology can be used to create those benefits, just in the way that we use biotechnology all the time in medicine, for example, insulin and others. Consumers don't really seem that averse to it because it's pretty darn clear what the advantage is for the typical user of insulin. So it's just a back of the mind issue. So that's another possible way in which I think these labels could be helpful, is for people to associate future benefits with the technologies.
I think that's a great point, because this is the problem that has plagued the whole GM industry from the beginning, that the consumer doesn't see the benefit. Obviously a farmer will see the benefit from growing GM canola if they get a 10% better yield. But you stop someone on the street corner and ask them what canola is, they don't know if you hunt it, if you fish it, or you grow it. So they don't see any benefit. And, I've always suggested that one of the biggest problems we had was that the first GM product that came on the market, which was the Flavor Saver tomato, didn't live up to its, optimistic press. It did not taste like a freshly picked tomato in August. If that would have worked, I think it would have changed the whole scene because people would have appreciated benefits from the beginning. But because that failed, then we had to start looking at things like canola that people don't really understand and don't see the benefit. So I think you were absolutely right in saying that we will get over the hump of the resistance to GM when people see the benefits of it. And I don't have a crystal ball, but I would suggest that 50 years from now, people will look back and say, I can't believe that there was ever any opposition to genetically modifying foods.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joe. I'll kind of have you probably expand a little bit on what you have already talked about a little bit in this conversation, which is ingredients and nutrition for GMOs. So I know nutrition might not be your forte, Joe, but you're kind of a jack of all trades scientifically for us.
Well, actually, it is my forte.
Oh, perfect. So are there any benefits nutrition-wise in ensuring that GMOs are properly labeled? Or is there anything that consumers need to be concerned about when it comes to GMOs being in their food?
Well, first of all, I mean, of course, there are regulations about GM foods, and they cannot be nutritionally unequivalent to the non-GM counterpart. Whether or not there's any enhanced nutrition, I mean, that's a totally different question. In some cases, I think the answer can be a decided yes. If you look at things like golden rice, as I'm sure listeners know, there are about 1 million children every year who go blind or experience other severe difficulties because of a lack of vitamin A in the diet. And beta carotene, which is the body's precursor to vitamin A, is in short supply in most of the foods that they eat in the developing world, like rice is the main component of their diet. Well, of course, it has long been possible to genetically engineer rice to increase its levels of beta carotene. And at first, there were problems with the technology, and some of the critics actually were correct in saying that there wasn't enough beta carotene in there to make a difference. But today there is, and there's no question that this works. And the Philippines, of course, has recently allowed the growing of beta carotene enhanced rice, much to the concern of the anti-GMOs who kind of suggest that this is poisoning the public, which is absolute nonsense. What it is going to do is reduce deaths, and it's going to reduce blindness. And the same way that this can be done, there are other components of food that can be bioengineered into the food. And I think bioengineered is a much more acceptable term than genetic modification for the public. For example, everyone talks about the health benefits of broccoli, which is true. When you chew broccoli, it releases a compound called sulforaphane, which at least in laboratory studies has anti-cancer effects. But it's don't rank broccoli among their favorite foods, but they like potatoes. So it is certainly possible to re-engineer potatoes so they will have a higher content of sulforaphane-releasing compounds. I think that this is something that should be pursued. Obviously, again, the anti-GMO people will resist that because they will say that, this is not natural. And, that's one of the biggest myths that I have fought for 40 years. This notion that if something is natural, it's good. And if it's, in any case, engineered or synthetic, it's bad. I mean, this is a total nonsense, of course. The safety of a substance or its danger has nothing to do with its ancestry, with the way that it was manufactured. What it has to do with is what we know about it, how we have studied it in the laboratory, not whether it was made by a chemist in a lab or by Mother Nature in a plant. That's irrelevant. What is relevant is what we know about it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joe. I think that's well said. We have enough time for just one more question, and I'm going to squeeze in our last audience member question. This question is from Ashley Robinson. And Joe, I will direct it to you first. And Jason, if you have anything to add, please chime in. Do diet trends have any effect when it comes to GMO labeling? Is there any way, like the new fad diets, keto diets, things like that, factor into how people make their food choices?
Well, of course, overweight is one of the big problems we face here in North America, and there are all sorts of answers to what to do. The only problem is that most of those answers are wrong, because we obviously haven't solved the problem of overweight. And to be frank, I don't think that GMOs are going to be the answer to that as well. They are not designed to either enhance or cut down on the amount of calories that people consume. Now, in theory, of course, there are all kinds of possibilities. There's the possibility of engineering what we call prebiotics into food, because we have increased knowledge about how many conditions, including overweight, may be related to the bacteria that are found in our guts, the so-called microbiome. And we know that people who are overweight have a different compendium of these bacteria than people who have normal weight. And that's interesting, because it is indeed possible to kind of increase the so-called good bacteria in our gut by giving the bacteria the proper nutrients so that they will multiply and squeeze out the potentially disease-causing or, quote, bad bacteria. And these are the so-called prebiotics. And it is possible, certainly, to engineer prebiotic components into crops. This is something I think that holds great potential for the future. So although people think of GM like a Pandora's box, I don't look at it like that at all. I think it's a treasure chest that we're opening up because of all the possibilities that it affords, and eventually may play a role in obesity.
Thank you so much, Joe. Jason, do you have anything to add about dieting and GMO labeling?
Yeah, maybe a narrow comment and a broader comment. On the narrow point, sure. Just think about something like sugar. You can have high fructose corn syrup. You could have sugar from beet, sugar from cane. And on the economic front, what you see is, over time, as the non-GMO label got, more popular, you saw some food manufacturers switching from beet to cane sugar because of the GMO issues. So you started to see a divergence in those prices there. So that relates to trends a little bit, I guess, in terms of, what types of sugar consumers want in their diet. I'd say more broadly, I kind of view some of these issues, there's sort of a halo type treadmill that I think food companies are on in sort of sustainability space. So first, everything, was about, is it organic? And then, once that kind of came, it's still here, of course, but that was not the fashionable thing. And then is it all local? And then the question is, later was, the word sustainable, and then clean became the word. And then plant-based was the word. Now the word seems to be regenerative. So we tend to go through these cycles of new claims that people want, here and there. And they all tend to, I've written about this a bit on my blog. People can read about why those things kind of gain in popularity and come and go. And so I think, sure, GMOs sort of fit into some of those narratives more than others. And I think it does speak to the fact that people conflate GMOs with some of those broader issues of concerns they have about our food supply chain system. And to the extent they relate GMOs to issues related to, say, concentration, vertical integration, use of, pesticides or herbicides, those things can come and go as these trends come and go.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jason. And thank you so much to both of you for joining us. Unfortunately, that is about all the time we have today. So just a reminder for our audience, if you missed a portion of this live or joined late, we'll be putting up the recording on seedworld.com within the next couple of days. And if you liked this topic, make sure you tune in next week to hear Ashley Robinson talk about what it'll take to go green as an industry. Agriculture has for decades decades been working to help soil and the environment, but with climate change in the headlines and ag under the microscope, what can agriculture do differently or currently to go green? She's going to be taking a closer look at practices such as regenerative ag and carbon pricing. So make sure to tune in next week. And until then, we'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone.